Welcome to Night Shift Knowledge, a quiet place in the late hours where you can finally let go of the day. Take a moment to settle in, soften your shoulders, and allow the busy world to fade completely into the background. Tonight, we are going on a gentle journey through the fascinating corners of science, biology, and history. Before we begin, please know that the screen will fade to dark very soon. You can safely rest your eyes and leave this video playing as you drift off to sleep. I would also love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below with a general topic you would like me to cover in a future video. It is always a pleasure to read your ideas and shape this channel around what brings you peace. If you find comfort in this space, a like and a subscribe would be deeply appreciated. To ensure the next video quietly finds its way to you, please tap the notification bell. So as your breathing slows and your room grows a little darker, let your curiosity drift along with my voice. Let us begin. The doomsday algorithm. The air tastes like metal. It tastes like burning graphite and ozone. April 26, 1986. The control room of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is a shattered skeleton of concrete and steel. 2,000 tons of radioactive fuel are exposed to the open air. The Geiger counters aren't just clicking, they are screaming. It is a scream that will be heard across the globe, a sound that signals the end of an era. But 60 kilometers away in the city of Kyiv, the silence is different. It is heavy. It is terrified. But in one specific, nondescript building on Akademika Glushkova Avenue, there is no panic. There is only a grim, cold certainty. While the world watched the ghostly firemen climb the ruins of the reactor, a small group of physicists and mathematicians sat in a dim room. They weren't watching the news feeds. They were looking at a printout generated by a mainframe computer that had been built nearly 2 decades prior. They had run the numbers. Years ago, they knew the system was fragile. They knew the tipping point was coming. The explosion at Chernobyl wasn't an unpredictable accident of physics to them. It was a failure of information. It was a variable they had calculated, predicted, and warned about only to be ignored. To understand why they weren't surprised, we have to go back to the man who built the machine that saw the future. Viktor Glushkov, a genius who carried the fate of an empire in a briefcase. He wasn't a politician nor a general. He was a cybernetician, a scientist who believed that mathematics could save the Soviet Union from itself. This was the Institute of Cybernetics. In the 1960s, the Western press called it the Silicon Valley of the USSR. It was a bubble of electric freedom in a sea of totalitarian control. While the rest of Moscow dealt in bureaucracy and red tape, Glushkov and his team dealt in logic. They spoke a language of binary code that transcended the dialectics of the Communist Party. Glushkov wasn't just building computers. He was trying to build a brain for the Soviet economy. He believed that if you could gather enough data, if you could process the flow of steel, wheat, and energy in real time, you could eliminate chaos. You could plan the perfect society. You could optimize the inefficient lumbering giant of the Soviet state into a sleek precision engine. But data has a habit of revealing the truth. And the truth about the Soviet economy was that it was bleeding out. The system was inefficient, corrupt, and dangerously unstable. Glushkov's algorithms weren't just optimizing supply chains, they were diagnosing a terminal illness. The machine was beginning to realize that the inputs didn't match the outputs. He saw the cracks forming. He saw the pressure building in the pipelines, the reactors, and the supply lines. He tried to warn them. He tried to tell the bureaucrats in Moscow that the numbers didn't lie. But the party didn't want a diagnosis, they wanted a miracle. They didn't want a machine telling them that their foundation was rotting. The evidence was buried in a report known as PROMEN. It was a comprehensive analysis of the nation's energy infrastructure, run through Glushkov's algorithms. The results were terrifying. The report predicted that without a centralized, automated control system to manage the load, the complexity of the Soviet energy grid would outpace human ability to manage it. It stated that a catastrophic failure wasn't just a possibility, it was a statistical inevitability. The PROMEN report identified the specific nodes in the network where the pressure was highest. It pointed to the aging reactors, the lack of safety protocols, and the desperate push for quotas over safety. It was a roadmap to disaster. Glushkov and his team presented these findings to the State Committee. They laid the blueprint for survival on the table. They offered a way to fix the glitch before the system crashed. They offered the algorithm that could have prevented the sirens. The response was not a fix. It was a silence. The report was classified. The algorithm was shelved. Glushkov was sidelined, his influence curtailed until his death in 1982. They locked the truth away in a vault, thinking that if they ignored the warning, the danger would disappear. But the mathematics of reality are unforgiving. You can redact a document, but you cannot redact the laws of physics. 4 years after Glushkov died, the sirens finally wailed. The reactor exploded. The doomsday algorithm had been right, and now, the silence of the archives is the loudest sound of all. The Silicon Valley of Ukraine. The air tastes like metal. It tastes like burning graphite and ozone. That is the memory of Chernobyl, the night the sky caught fire and the future of the Soviet Union fractured open. But that radiation, that invisible poison, didn't just come from the uranium splitting inside reactor number 4. It was the fallout from a dream that died decades before the concrete sarcophagus was ever poured. To understand how the Silicon Valley of Ukraine was born, we have to step back from the cooling towers of the 1980s and step into the shadow of the Iron Curtain at its coldest. We have to go back to a time when the word computer was considered a dirty word in Moscow. This was the dark age of Soviet science. Under Stalin, biology was dictated by ideology, not observation. Genetics was a bourgeois lie. And in the late 1940s, a new field emerged from the West, a field that proposed that machines could think, that information could control systems. They called it cybernetics. The Soviet ideologues didn't see a tool, they saw a threat. They declared cybernetics a capitalist plot, a pseudoscience on par with astrology. To suggest that a machine, a lifeless collection of gears and tubes, could replicate the human mind, or worse, manage the complex economy of the state, was heresy. It was counter-revolutionary. For the mathematicians and physicists trapped in this intellectual winter, survival meant silence. You didn't research information theory, you studied technical mathematics. You didn't build computers, you built calculating machines. The struggle wasn't just against the limitations of vacuum tubes, it was against the terror of the midnight knock on the door. But then, the winter broke. In 1953, Stalin died. The thaw that followed allowed the frozen ideas of the past to resurface. And while Moscow was busy cleaning house, a quiet revolution was taking place 500 miles to the south. This is Kiev. The year is 1957. While Silicon Valley was still mostly apricot farms in California, Kiev was about to become the beating heart of the Soviet digital empire. They called it the Kiev Miracle. Here, in the capital of Ukraine, the Soviet government sanctioned the creation of the Institute of Cybernetics. It was a sanctuary for the brightest minds the USSR had to offer. men and women who had spent years hiding their genius in the margins. At the helm was Viktor Glushkov. He wasn't a politician, he was a prodigy of mathematics. He saw the world not as a struggle of classes, but as a struggle of systems. Glushkov did the impossible. He poached the best mathematicians from the Academy of Sciences in Moscow and brought them to the Ukrainian steppe. They weren't just building labs, they were building a culture. In this corner of the Soviet Union, ideology took a backseat to logic. They were racing against the Americans, racing against the clock, and racing against their own bureaucracy. They built the first personal computer in the Soviet Union here. They built machines that could speak. But Glushkov had a vision that went far beyond hardware. He called it OGAS, the All-State Automated System for Processing Information. To understand the stakes, you have to understand the Soviet economy. It was drowning. It was a sea of paper. A single pair of shoes manufactured in Leningrad might require 30 different forms, signed by 10 different bureaucrats, transported on a train scheduled weeks in advance. By the time the paperwork caught up to the product, the shoes were rotting in a warehouse, or the factory was sitting idle waiting for steel that never came. OGAS was the answer. It was a dream of a real-time, automated economy. Imagine a nervous system for a superpower. Glushkov proposed a network of computer centers spanning the entire nation, connected by thousands of miles of telephone lines. Every transaction, every shipment, every kilogram of grain would be tracked instantly. The computer would know exactly what was needed, where, and when. It was the promise of eliminating shortages. It was the promise of eliminating human error. It was the promise of a perfectly planned utopia, governed not by corrupt officials, but by the pure, impartial logic of the algorithm. It sounded like science fiction, but it was dangerously close to reality. By 1970, the network was already partially built. They had the hardware. They had the software. They had the mathematicians. They had everything they needed to leapfrog the West and build the internet 20 years early. But in the Soviet Union, efficiency is often the enemy of power. To build OGAS, Glushkov wasn't just asking for money, he was asking for the dismantling of the Soviet bureaucracy itself. He was asking the thousands of middle managers, the paper pushers who controlled the flow of goods, to surrender their power to a machine. The dream of the Silicon Valley of Ukraine wasn't defeated by a lack of brilliance. It wasn't defeated by the Americans, it was defeated by fear. The Soviet Union had the chance to digitize the world, but a computer cannot be bribed. A computer does not care about party loyalty, and that made it the most dangerous enemy of all. Teaching machines to think. The air tasted like metal. It tasted like burning graphite and ozone. That is the memory of Chernobyl, the night the sky caught fire and the future of the Soviet Union fractured open. But that radiation, that invisible poison, didn't just come from the uranium splitting inside reactor number 4. It was the fallout from a dream that died decades before the concrete sarcophagus was ever poured. In the wake of the Second World War, the Soviet state was obsessed with a singular goal: to conquer uncertainty. They wanted to tame the chaos of nature and the volatility of the human economy, bending them both to the will of the plan. For a long time, they tried to do this with simple arithmetic. They used calculators, massive, clunky electromechanical beasts that could tally the production of steel or the yield of a wheat harvest. But a calculator can only tell you what is. It cannot tell you what will be. This was the bottleneck of the command economy. It was a system paralyzed by its own inertia. By the time the 5-year plan reached the desk of a factory manager in Kiev, the market conditions had already changed. The weather had turned. The supply lines had shifted. They were always driving while looking in the rear-view mirror. What they needed wasn't a faster calculator. They needed a machine that could see through time. This was the genesis of Promen. It wasn't designed to be a calculator, it was designed to be an oracle. The architects of this system looked to meteorology for inspiration. For centuries, predicting the weather was considered guesswork, an art form steeped in folklore. But by the 1960s, it had become a science. By analyzing atmospheric pressure and wind vectors, you could predict a storm 3 days in advance. The Soviet cyberneticists asked a radical question: what if an economy was just like the weather? What if supply and demand were just high and low pressure systems? Promen was built to map the climate of human industry. It was a leap from static mathematics to dynamic modeling. Where a standard computer solved linear equations, A plus B equals C, Promen ran simulations. It created a digital twin of the Soviet energy grid, a virtual playground where millions of variables interacted simultaneously. It was the brain of Kiev, a cybernetic cortex that didn't just process numbers, it processed consequences. The system's primary directive was optimization. It sought the path of least resistance, the most efficient way to generate and distribute power across the vast network of the Ukrainian SSR. But to find the optimum, Promen had to do something dangerous. It had to imagine failure. It ran thousands of worst-case scenarios every hour. It simulated heat waves that froze turbines. It simulated sudden drops in coal production. It was constantly stress testing the grid, looking for the weak links in the chain. At first, the results were miraculous. Efficiency rose, blackouts decreased. The machine seemed to understand the pulse of the nation better than the people running it. But there was a problem emerging from the logic, a paradox at the heart of the code. Promen was beginning to identify inefficiencies that it could not fix. The machine was unbiased. It didn't care about politics, pride, or the 5-year plan. It only cared about the math. And the math was saying that the infrastructure was decaying faster than it was being repaired. The system flagged red flags, critical warnings about specific transformers in the north, specific cooling pumps in the south. It was predicting energy grid failures based on variables the human operators refused to acknowledge: the lack of spare parts, the poor training of staff, the corruption in the supply chain. This created a terrifying disconnect. The brain of Kiev was screaming into the void. It was modeling a future where the grid didn't just stutter, but collapsed. To Promen, these were just variables to be adjusted. But to the men in charge, these were accusations of incompetence. The machine was telling them that the house of cards was swaying, and their response wasn't to reinforce the foundation. It was to turn down the volume. They silenced the alarms. They filtered the data. They treated the grim predictions of the machine as system errors rather than insights. They taught the machine to think, but they refused to learn from what it said. And so, the machine kept thinking. It kept simulating the worst-case scenarios, refining its models of disaster with a cold, terrifying precision. It knew exactly how much pressure the system could take before it shattered. It was waiting for the night the variables would finally align. The machine had foreseen the fire. It had calculated the fallout. But a prediction is only useful if someone is willing to listen. And in the halls of power, silence was the only thing louder than the truth. The Cassandra report. The air tasted like metal. It tasted like burning graphite and ozone. That is the memory of Chernobyl, the night the sky caught fire and the future of the Soviet Union fractured open. But as we established, that radiation, that invisible poison, didn't just come from the uranium splitting inside reactor number 4. It was the fallout from a dream that died decades before the concrete sarcophagus was ever poured. The year is 1970. The dream is called OGAS, the nationwide automated system for processing information. It was meant to be the electronic spine of the Soviet Union, an internet of the people built not for profit, but for perfect planning. And standing in the center of this crucible is the man who dared to measure the pulse of the state, Viktor Glushkov. Glushkov knew he was running out of time. The Soviet economy was showing the first signs of the sickness that would eventually kill it. Inefficiency was no longer just a nuisance, it was a parasite. And the only cure was the network. But to administer the cure, he first had to convince the patient that the diagnosis was real. This is the climax of the conflict, a quiet war fought in the smoky rooms of the Politburo. Glushkov was there to present the Cassandra Report, a document so named because it predicted a future the powerful refused to believe. He placed his graphs on the table. They were stark, red lines trending downward, indicating a terrifying reality. Without the network, Glushkov argued, the Soviet economy would stagnate. The command system was too complex for the human brain. It was like trying to calculate the weather with an abacus. The numbers were getting too big, the variables too wild. He looked around the room at the men who held the strings of the empire. And there was silence. Not the silence of contemplation, but the heavy, suffocating silence of denial. It is the sound of ideology colliding with reality, and ideology refusing to blink. These men were not engineers, they were apparatchiks. They did not trust the logic of the machine, they trusted the weight of their own authority. To understand why they refused, you have to understand who they were protecting. The enemy wasn't the United States. The enemy was the bureaucracy itself. The Soviet Union was run by thousands of factory directors and regional managers, little czars of their own domains. Under the current system, a factory director could manipulate his reports. If he missed a quota, he could fudge the numbers, trade favors with a supplier, or hoard resources in a warehouse for a rainy day. It was a system built on human relationships, corruption, and grey markets. It was messy, but it gave them power. OGAS threatened to strip that power away. If Glushkov's network went live, every bolt, every ruble, every kilowatt of energy would be tracked in real time by a computer in Moscow. The algorithm wouldn't accept a bribe. The algorithm didn't care about your friendship with the party boss. The algorithm would simply expose the inefficiency. So, the bureaucrats fought back. They launched a quiet, insidious campaign of sabotage. They didn't blow up the servers, they simply refused to plug them in. Factory directors across the Union began to disconnect the OGAS nodes that Glushkov's team had so painstakingly installed. They cited technical difficulties or incompatibility. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. They starved the project of data. Without data, the network was blind. And without the network, Glushkov had no leverage. He wasn't just fighting against technology, he was fighting against human nature and the instinct for self-preservation. Back in the Politburo, the decision was made. The uncomfortable silence broke not with applause, but with a bureaucratic shrug. The Cassandra Report was taken, stamped top secret, and shelved in a basement archive where it could do no harm. If the problem was classified, perhaps it would simply cease to exist. The verdict was absolute. Funding for the institute was slashed. The money that was meant to build the digital future was redirected to heavy industry, to make more steel, more concrete, more things that could be weighed and measured, rather than the invisible flow of information. Glushkov was effectively dismissed. The dream of the Soviet internet was dead. But the consequences of that decision were just beginning to ripple through time. By killing the messenger, the state had sealed its own fate. They chose the comfort of the lie over the pain of the truth. Without the feedback loop of the network, the economy went blind. It stumbled forward through the 70s and 80s, fueled by oil revenue and denial, slowly rotting from the inside out. The stagnation that Glushkov predicted became the daily reality of the Soviet citizen. The Chernobyl disaster, 16 years later, was the final, violent convulsion of a system that had lost its ability to sense its own failing. The reactor exploded because the operators were afraid, the protocols were unclear, and the system was too rigid to correct itself. A system that Glushkov had tried to fix. Viktor Glushkov died in 1982, just 4 years before the fire at Reactor 4. He never saw his dream realized. But as we look back at the ruins of the Soviet experiment, we are left with a haunting question that echoes through the ages. When a society chooses to ignore the data, when it values power over truth, is collapse inevitable? Or is it simply a choice we make every single day to look away? Sabotage and silence. The battle was over, and in the eyes of the Soviet bureaucracy, they had won. In the boardrooms of Gosplan and the State Committee for Science and Technology, the champagne, or rather the vodka, was flowing. There were no medals awarded for this victory, no parades in Red Square, but the relief was palpable. The machine had been defeated. The threat of Glushkov's OGA, the network that was supposed to link the factories of the nation into a single, thinking brain, had been neutralized. To the mid-level managers, OGAS was never a tool, it was a guillotine. It promised transparency. It promised accountability. And to a system built on shadow economies and padded production numbers, that was a death sentence. So they unplugged it, not with a single switch, but with 1,000 paper cuts. Budgets were slashed. Access lines were diverted to telephone networks. The scientists were reassigned to projects that mattered less, but threatened the status quo even less. The physical dismantling began in the silence of the server rooms. Cables that once carried the pulse of a planned economy were ripped from the walls, stripped for copper, or left to rot in the dust. The terminals, once the windows to a digital future, were covered with tablecloths and used as stands for potted plants or stacks of unread paperwork. The victory was absolute. The bureaucrats had reclaimed their territory. They had saved the Soviet Union from efficiency. They had secured their right to manage the economy with pencils and ledgers, just as their fathers had, and just as their fathers' fathers had. But as the silence settled over the data centers, a heavy, creeping chill began to set in. It was the cold of a future that had been cancelled. And in that silence, a singular voice was extinguished. Viktor Glushkov, the man who had seen the inevitable, the prophet of the Silicon Age, was dying. Not from the radiation of a reactor, but from the slow, grinding pressure of a system that refused to listen. Visual, a funeral procession. We see a coffin being carried through a crowd of coat-clad mourners. The sky is a bruised purple. In January 1982, Glushkov passed away. The funeral was quiet, attended not by state leaders, but by the scattered remnants of his team. The mathematicians, the cyberneticists, the dreamers who had believed that logic could save a country built on ideology. Standing there in the biting cold of a Russian winter, they didn't just mourn a man. They mourned the path not taken. They watched as the body of their commander was lowered into the frozen earth, and with him, the last living hope for a reformed Soviet Union. The team dispersed, drifting away into the academic hinterlands or into the obscurity of military research labs. The institute Glushkov had built was renamed, repurposed, stripped of its radical mandate. The energy was gone. The optimism had curdled into cynicism. It was a silence that felt, to those who knew, like the holding of a breath. And while the bureaucrats celebrated their autonomy, the economy they were sworn to manage began its slow, agonizing descent into the abyss. Glushkov had run the models. He had predicted the crash with mathematical precision. He knew that without a nervous system to coordinate it, the massive body of the Soviet state would inevitably stumble. Stagnation set in. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a rot. Shortages became the norm. Quality control evaporated. The shadow economy, the very thing OGAS was designed to eliminate, swelled to become the only thing that actually kept the lights on. The center could not hold. Because the center was blind. The planners in Moscow were flying blind, navigating a supersonic power with a map from the previous decade. They were making decisions based on data that was months old, or data that was simply fabricated to meet targets. The feedback loop was broken. And nowhere was this blindness more dangerous than in the nuclear sector. The Soviet Union had pinned its energy hopes on the RBMK reactor, a giant, graphite-moderated beast of a machine. It was cheap to build. It produced plutonium for bombs, and it had a fatal flaw in its design. Designers knew about the instability in the reactor's core. They knew that under certain conditions, pressing the emergency button, the AZ5 button, could actually accelerate the nuclear reaction rather than stop it. But in the fragmented, compartmentalized bureaucracy of the 1980s, this information was siloed. It was never shared. The operators in Chernobyl were not incompetent. They were courageous. But they were operating a machine without a brain. They were flying a plane without a radar, because the network that could have correlated data from reactors across the Union, that could have spotted the anomaly, that could have screamed, "Stop!" that network had been unplugged years ago. The sabotage was complete. The silence was total. And in that silence, the ticking resumed. Not from a telegraph, and not from a Geiger counter, but from the clock counting down to the inevitable. The air was about to taste like metal again. The future that was. The champagne went flat, the vodka bottles were emptied, and as the 1970s bled into the 80s, the victors of that bureaucratic war returned to their desks. They believed they had preserved the integrity of the Soviet state. They believed that by killing the project, they had killed the chaos that change brings. But in reality, they had merely unplugged the smoke alarm. They had chosen to navigate a supertanker through a hurricane using a map drawn in 1917. And the icebergs were moving. Viktor Glushkov's Promen system wasn't just about accounting, it was about simulation. It was designed to model the risk graphs of the entire nation, a way to see the dominoes before they fell. In the archives, we still have the printouts. They show probability curves for industrial accidents, for supply chain failures, for systemic shock. Look closely at the data for the Ukrainian energy grid. Glushkov's algorithms predicted a critical failure point if outdated maintenance protocols continued without automated oversight. The bureaucrats ignored the math. They trusted their 5-year plans. In 1986, the failure occurred, not because the Soviets lacked engineers or brilliance, but because the system was too slow, too opaque, and too terrified of the truth to react in time. The warning signs were there, buried under paperwork that no one could read in time. The disaster wasn't just a failure of a reactor, it was the failure of the nervous system to tell the brain it was burning. And then came the final collapse. The economic unraveling of 1991 wasn't an ambush, it was a slow-motion train wreck that Glushkov had forecasted decades earlier. Without real-time data, the center could not hold. The planned economy suffocated under the weight of its own latency. They ran out of everything, wheat, steel, time, because the ledger was always days, weeks, months behind reality. The empire fell not because of a missile, but because of a spreadsheet that never existed. But let us pause here. Let us step away from the wreckage of history and ask the dangerous question, the what if? What if the bureaucrats had lost that day in 1970? What if Glushkov had been allowed to plug the Soviet Union into the grid? If OGAS had gone online, the Cold War wouldn't have been a contest of nuclear brinkmanship, it would have been a duel of algorithms. The Soviet Union would have possessed the world's first internet, a closed-loop system where supply and demand were balanced not by the invisible hand of the market, but by the visible hand of cybernetics. Economists today still debate if a planned economy can actually work. The economic calculation problem suggests that no central authority can ever process enough information to match the efficiency of a free market. But Glushkov was trying to prove that theorem wrong with brute force computing power. He wasn't trying to restrict information, he was trying to liberate it to save the system. Could a machine state have survived? Perhaps the USSR wouldn't have become a liberal democracy, but it might have evolved into a terrifyingly efficient techno-autocracy. Or perhaps a prosperous cyber-socialism. We will never know. The data was deleted before the experiment could begin. In the end, this is a story about a man who saw the future, tried to build it, and was buried by the past. Viktor Glushkov died in 1982, just as the personal computer was beginning to revolutionize the West. He was 60 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him said he died of a broken heart. He is a tragic hero of the information age, a Soviet Alan Turing who didn't have to endure chemical castration, but who suffered the slow, bureaucratic suffocation of his life's work. He wanted to use the computer to free humanity from manual labor, to elevate the Soviet worker to a manager of ideas. Instead, his machines were used to count the nails in the coffins of the empire. But ideas have a strange persistence. They echo. The ghost of OGAS is all around us, in every supply chain algorithm that predicts your Amazon delivery, in every predictive model that manages a city's power grid. The logic Glushkov championed, the logic of the network, won the war, even if his side lost the battle. The Soviet Union is gone. The Berlin Wall is rubble. But here, in the glow of 1 million screens, in the fiber optic cables buried beneath the frozen soil of the former Eastern Bloc, the future that Viktor Glushkov imagined is finally waking up. We have reached the end of tonight's topics, and it is time to let your mind completely unwind. Whatever you learned tonight, let it fade into a soft hum as you drift off. Thank you for being a part of Night Shift Knowledge and sharing this quiet space with me. Remember to leave a topic suggestion for next time if you are still awake, but for now, just rest. Sleep well, and I will be here the next time you need to quiet your mind. Good night.